we had that session, the Swift start, that's what it was, where we had somebody from finance come tell us about, the tax benefits of owning a house versus renting. And it's like, I don't think that quite applies to any of our situations, but I appreciate your input nonetheless. Yeah, let me get on that as soon as I can.
Yeah,
Sure. I'll
I'm
buy a
I'm
house to save
I'm
on
getting
taxes.
that I'm getting that mortgage ASAP, Rocky. So.
Yeah.
All right. Welcome everyone to the third episode of Responder Chain. I have my longtime friend, probably one of the longest time friends I have in the Mac programming space, which is Itai Ferber, previous roommate and roommate for like 2 years or so, 3 years almost. And then yeah, we haven't talked in a while, so I figured this episode will mostly just talk about ourselves, and we're not really going to do a coding portion, but yeah, so let's just start with how we first met each other. So we originally started as interns at Apple. This was back in 2016, I guess. That's when I graduated college. Or no, actually, we interned in 2015, right?
Yeah.
1 year before we did that, and so we were in the same housing unit together, and then we I won't talk about our other roommates, I guess, but we at least enjoyed each other's company, and you can talk about what you worked on, I guess, at the time at Apple, and yeah.
Uh, you know what? I don't even exactly remember what I was working on at Apple at the time.
Well, you were at
Uh,
least on what team you were on, you know that much.
yeah, yeah. I was working on the foundation team at the time. This had been the second summer that I was interning there on that team. And I'll share this about I mean one of my favorite memories from the summer is actually when we first this was the first day I think that this is the first day that I moved in. I don't remember if we both moved in the first day together. Um, I think you may have arrived a day before me, but uh, I think we were the only two around, and we were both sort of hungry, and so this was like an area of Cupertino that I had been in before, but I didn't quite remember. I don't know if you remember, we walked over to get pizza at Metro Pizza, which is a place that doesn't exist anymore.
I didn't know it actually. Was it gone when we left?
It was at the same plaza that Freedom Burrito was at, and it had
Yeah, I
closed at some point. Yeah.
oh, I
Uh,
didn't remember
but
those.
between that internship and when we moved out, it had closed. But anyway, so we were sitting there and we were sort of doing almost exactly this, in effect. You had asked me about sort of like what my background was and like macOS and programming in general and stuff, and we were talking about our experience, and I thought to myself like, wow, I finally have another friend who has basically the same background as I do on like macOS and programming and iOS stuff and Objective-C, and it was just like extremely exciting because I didn't know anyone else at the time who was doing the same sort of stuff that we were doing. So that was sort of how I remember meeting you, and that was my first impression. I was like, wow, okay, somebody who was a lot like me, and it was very exciting at the time. And yeah, so throughout the summer, I mean, we got to share a lot of that stuff together, but it was great.
The burritos were pretty good too, but yeah. So yeah, I mean, we had that first year internship, and you were on foundation team at the time, and I don't remember what you were working on, I guess, as an intern, but I was still on the photos team doing internship, and I'd also met Jonathan Willing, which he was more well known probably in earlier days for macOS stuff. He had a lot of different blog posts and stuff on core animation and whatnot, but so he was fun to work with when I was there. But yeah, we basically hung out, and then I guess near the end of that, I met Jen as well, and then we both left to go back to school, and then we both came back to Apple after that for full-time work, and you were also in Foundation after that, and I went back to Photos, and we were roommates for another 2 years after that, I
Yeah.
guess. But so yeah, so I guess I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about your background in macOS before that. I know we've talked about that before, but talk about kind of how you got into macOS originally.
Yeah. So the first experience I ever had with macOS at all was in middle school. We had to get laptops for school. and we all had to get the same laptop as a crappy old iBook G4. And I knew almost nothing about computers at this point. I'd never touched a Mac before. I didn't know
What
how they
year was
were.
this?
This was, oh man, 2004, I think. 2004, 2005. This was, I think, macOS, I think Tiger came out during the school year when we had gotten those laptops. So those laptops shipped with what, Panther 10.3?
I'm not gonna try to remember which versions were in the earlier ones, but yeah,
Anyway, this was a while back, but it was extremely exciting, and this was not the point where I got started with macOS, but this was the point where I started messing around a little bit more with computers. I started digging in a little bit into all of the stuff that was normally hidden on the computer. So I spent a lot of time in system library core services. One time I managed to delete the login window nib file and hosed my installation of macOS because I couldn't log in because the nib file was gone and it couldn't display the login window anymore. So that was exciting. So I did a bunch of stuff like that. But I guess a few years later, I didn't at the time really know much at all about programming. I actually didn't have a concept of programming. I had a friend who could do some cool stuff in Excel, and I guess it was VBA, but I didn't know what it was at the time. And I asked him to teach me, and he said no. So that was the start and end of that. But I sort of knew that there was something possible that you could do with computers, but I didn't really think about how software got made. And then I think at some point I picked up. I realized, like, I'd learned a little bit about C++ and what you could do with it. And I thought that was really exciting. And so one summer I went to this summer program called CTY through Johns Hopkins University. It was basically what I call nerd camp. It was a summer camp that you actually had to take the SATs to get into this place. And I think I got the minimum possible score needed to get in. But I took a 3-week course. It was Intro to C++, or Intro to Programming through C++, which is a horrible way to get started. And I learned the very, very basics of C++, and I was absolutely terrible at it. But those 3 weeks were so exciting. And so when I got home, I was like, okay, I want to learn more of this. I really liked it. Where do I go from here? And so I Googled around a little bit, like, how do you program on Mac? I was like, what do I do now?
What do you do?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I had written. I remember one of the things that I had written after that class was, I guess it was sort of an encryption program, and encryption is deeply in quotes because it would basically, you would put in text and it would jumble up the text. But because I didn't know anything about encryption, I had to figure out how to decrypt the text afterwards. So I saved the encryption key effectively, which is random. I saved it to a hidden file in the folder that you were in, so that you could decrypt it later using that hidden file. That was as much as I knew at the time. It was very exciting. But I said, okay, I want to learn more about this and I want to do things right. And so I think this was around 2008, maybe 2009. So I think this was a summer between maybe 8th and ninth grade. Dates might be wrong. But I decided, okay, how do I do this right? And so I found that, okay, the main way to program on macOS is this language called Objective-C. Never heard of it, didn't know anything about it. Figured, okay, I can get a book or two and I'll learn about this. So I got
Still don't know anything about it. So
yeah, probably. So I picked up, I think the book is called Cocoa Programming for Mac OS X by Aaron Hilligas. I think it was the third edition of that book. And I picked up Objective-C by Stephen Kochar, edition 2, I think. They were the most popular books on Amazon for Objective-C at the time. And I cracked open Cocoa Programming for Mac OS, and I almost didn't understand any of it, but the first chapter had all the instructions you needed to put together a program in Xcode and Interface Builder back when they were still separate. This is Xcode 3, yeah. And had all the instructions to set up a small program for macOS that could convert temperatures from Fahrenheit to Celsius and back. That was the start and end of it. And I barely even read that chapter. I just followed the pictures and typed in the code as it was in the book. And I ran it, and it was just the most exciting thing ever. I showed my mom, and I was just so excited, and she of course didn't get why it was really exciting at all.
How I feel every time I ever showed my brother any of it. It was like even if it was cool, it was cooler than that too. You know, it was like almost a game where it was like a brick breaker, stupid rendition, and it's like, yeah, it's just not as cool as my current Xbox games. So
Yeah, yeah.
I don't understand why you're impressed by this. It's like, all right,
So
well,
that yeah, that's how I got started. That was after that I was sort of hooked. So I went through the rest of the book and I learned a lot more about macOS, and that was sort of the in for me. After that it got a lot more exciting, and I like most people I was terrible at it for a long time. And I eventually figured out that there's this really useful website called Stack Overflow where you could ask questions to other people who knew what they were talking about, and that was great. And this was back in the days where Overflow was a much smaller community, and you could actually ask questions without being downvoted to oblivion, and you could actually answer
this is a
questions.
dude.
Oh, it was fantastic. It was a great time. It was the magical age of Stack Overflow. Uh, and so yeah, it was just an exciting time. And then eventually Xcode 4 came out, and that was a big exciting moment for me. And yeah, it was so. But that was
I
sort of
remember that release is horrible, but
oh, it was terrible. It would crash all the time. It could barely, but it looked amazing. It looked so good.
yeah.
That was
Was
that
that
was
the
a
one that
big.
they introduced auto layout on macOS? I don't remember if that was 4 or 5.
I think it was much after that. Xcode 4 was the first one that integrated Interface Builder into the UI and had like the tab bar that was integrated with all the tools in it. I think Autolayer.
IB was in Xcode at that point, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I for some reason I remember auto layout coming in at the same time, but that I could be very wrong about that. But anyway,
It might have.
I think
My
maybe I'm
memory's
just
not good.
conflating all my negative thoughts towards Xcode. I just remember when auto layout first came out, and I just like you couldn't do anything right without it just yelling at you profusely, and yeah, it was not fun. But yeah, it's a little bit similar to my story, I guess, and I guess I haven't really talked about it in general, which was, I mean, we started back. So my uncle was a graphic designer, and he use Mac OS and to help us with our because we were morons, and he's like, well, at least to help you with troubleshooting, at least you can get the same computer and I can help you out that way when you have problems. And so we had Mac OS 9. I think maybe it started with 8, but I think 9 was probably what we started with, and we had games on there and stuff. And but I always just remember like even simple things like Kid Picks and Bonkheads were 2 games that we had, and just kind of the joy around like how does this work. And I think that always, even stupider things like Microsoft Word, even when I was using things like that, I just always wondered like I don't understand how they make this, how does any of this work? And so I think that was just kind of the curiosity there. And then I kind of had a similar thing where the first thing I think I actually started with was like the very first book probably was a book on, because I think the iPhone had just kind of come out at that point. I think that's probably when I like started to really get involved in it, but I never really, I wasn't really interested in the iPhone. I just know the iPhone had a better, more people were interested in it, and therefore the documentation to like learn it, like the book was more concrete there. I think I probably read the Coco one around there too, but I just remember the first time I got like 2 or 3 chapters in and said, I have no idea what the hell's going on. Like I just fundamentally didn't understand what was going on, and then I like went backwards, and that's actually when I started the YouTube channel. Was basically after I finished a book on C. I mean, as little as I actually knew, I decided to make the YouTube series, like starting off with that. And so I'm sure there's tons of information in those videos that is, totally wrong, but enough people like them, I guess. But so yeah, and then there was like I think it was A Press probably that had this series where they had like a C book, and then there was like an immediate predecessor book that came after that, which was for Objective C. So it was like a just purely Objective C book, no
Mhm.
UI, and that book was that like finally clicked for me how all this works. I'm like, oh, okay, now I understand. And then you could go into the UI stuff, and you had to handle some of the weird IB action, whatever stuff, but most of that was pretty easy once you kind of had a grasp of the language itself. So that was fun, and yeah, people always ask me that too, how you started to learn it, and I felt the same way with there wasn't a clear way. It's just kind of you like piece together a million different resources that kind of just have the information you're looking for, and it's still that way. I mean, I think of random questions that I have, and I'm still finding random questions that are probably from you half the time, and your top like 2% on stuff. I realized I hit 6% though the other not too long
Good for
ago.
you.
So I'm gaining.
Yeah, I haven't answered questions in a while, but I'm still raking in royalties from old answers. So
It's like the interest accrued from.
yeah, yeah.
It's nice to receive that, but I feel like I'm flatlining now. I haven't really answered anything, and most of the Coco questions are also not. Most people don't care about those anymore. So
Yeah.
anyway, so yeah. Anyway, let's go back to. So you did all that. Did you talk about Coco? Coco Camp.
Coco Camp?
Yeah.
No. So Coco Camp came a lot later, and I realized I got my timeline wrong. I had started not in 2008, 2009. It was earlier than that because I had started, I think, maybe 2006. It was before the iPhone came out. And actually, the iPhone came out, and I remember being completely disinterested in the iPhone and what it meant until I got an iPod Touch, and that was exciting. So I guess fast forward a few years in college. At this point, I had done a lot more with macOS. Nothing professionally, but I had done a lot for myself, and I was making small tools. And I had forayed a little bit into iPhone, enough to be able to get an internship freshman year doing some iPhone games for a company called BrainPop that I think a lot of people have heard of. This was before GameKit came out, so I actually ended up with an iOS framework for iOS 4 that handled a lot of game loop stuff and things like that. The summer after that, it used to be that Apple had this program for a while. I don't know when it started, but my year was the last year that they did it. They had a summer program called the Coco Camp. And what they would do is they would get maybe 100 applicants from around the world to send in a sample project to apply for this camp. And sort of the winners would get to visit Apple for a week, meet with some engineers, get sort of to see, it wasn't previews of anything. We didn't get to see anything that was upcoming, but we had a few people who had given WWDC talks come in and either sort of re-give their talk or talk about it, or sort of rerun through some of their slides. And so I had gotten into that, and it was actually through that program at Apple that I got to meet the then manager of the foundation team and the person who later became my manager on that team too. So that was sort of how I got to meet them and talk to them. And at that point, I had obviously done a lot with foundation, and I thought the data structures and algorithms was really exciting. The first year where I had gone to camp and learned about C++ a little bit, I thought, okay, this is neat. I came back to camp a year after, and I learned data structures and algorithms. And it was that year that was extremely exciting. And I thought, okay, this is what I want to do. This is like, I love this. I want to get into this. I re-implemented a ton of data structures on my own. Like, I thought that was really exciting, and they were all terrible, but I loved it. And so Foundation being the framework that had all of the sort of low-level classes, that was really exciting to me. And so I got to talk to them then, and we had a project that we had to do at the end of that week. So it was partially getting to meet Apple engineers, and it was partially also getting to impress Apple engineers. And so everyone at that week-long camp, basically we had the whole week to work on a project that we would then get at the end of the week to demo at an expo. And I was the only person in my group to do a macOS app. Everyone else did iOS apps.
Like my internship.
Yeah, exactly. And what I had done was I wrote basically a GUI front end for Homebrew, which is a tool on macOS. For people who don't know, it's effectively a package manager for macOS. There still aren't great graphical interfaces for it, but this is.
What's the current? There's like Cake something, or I don't. There's some GUI that is out there that I've used before, but anyway.
Yeah. Basically, all I did was the app would basically execute Homebrew and then parse its output and display it in the graphical interface. But it was something that I had wanted for a long time because I've been using Homebrew, I guess, almost since it came out. I think I was a pretty early adopter of it. And I was the only person at Coco Camp to make a macOS app. And sort of that I guess caught the eye of the foundation folks who I'd already talked to, and so they had invited me for an internship, and that's how I came back the next summer, the summer before we met.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's yeah. I I think it is funny to go through that sort of internship period, and I know when like I was really lucky to have Jonathan Willing with me because he was also a big macOS guy, and I'm like, oh, this is perfect. Like we're both gonna work on a macOS app, and that's gonna be what my project is this summer. And so, and it was funny going through like all the other internships that were there, and I mean there were on Photos team. There's also a lot of non-UI type things with image processing and various other things.
Yeah.
But at least out of the UI stuff, it's very common just to have iOS be the main thing. But
Yeah.
as it still is today. But yeah, so it's it definitely does pique people's interest though when you know how to do macOS stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
A skill that at least is appreciated around Apple. I guess maybe not in many other places, but
Yeah, it's really gone. It feels like appreciation for it has gone down. It's a lot more of a curiosity at this point.
Yeah,
For better or worse.
even probably internally, that's still the case. But
Yeah.
the more we go to Swift UI and Catalyst stuff, it's yeah. I don't know what AppKit will do, but I'll continue to probably use it for a while.
Yeah.
We'll see. So another thing I wanted to talk about was your actual work as working full-time at Apple on the foundation team. So trying to think of if you did this the first year. What did you work on the very first year on foundation?
So the very first year that I was on foundation, I worked on Codable for Swift. Yeah, so that was a year-long project. I was sort of the lead, and I won't say I was the only engineer on that. I had a lot of input from a teammate and from my manager at the time, and there was a lot of bouncing ideas off of them. But I was the principal sort of engineer on that, and I wrote that code, and I was living in the compiler, the Swift compiler a lot, and there was a lot of contributions to that. So it was less focused on foundation, the framework, and more on tooling that we wanted to eventually bring into Swift. This was right after the Swift 2 to 3 transition. When I started at Apple, we were really just wrapping up the Swift 3 release. This was sort of the last time where we were willing to make huge source-breaking changes. So after that experience wrapped up, we moved into, okay, next phases. And my manager had for a long time wanted to work on a new archival and serialization API for Swift. And so this was our opportunity to sort of do something new and explore that space. So that's what I did that first year.
Yeah. And so I know there were a lot of fun challenges you had with doing this, and I just wondered if we could talk a little bit about sort of first off why you didn't want to go with the current approach that we kind of had for Objective-C purposes already, and why you really took the way that you did with the Swift implementation of somewhat of the equivalent thing, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So there were a few things that we had learned from many years of experience working with the NSKeyed archiver, NSKeyed unarchiver, NS archiver, and even older format. Those APIs, we had learned a lot. From the security perspective, NSKeyed archiver embeds a lot of information in archives that NSKeyed unarchiver then trusts, which is not great from a security perspective. So that was one aspect that we wanted to improve. Another really big thing is we wanted to make use of the language as much as we could. Swift was a brand new world that had a lot of new features that we wanted to include. The biggest downside that we had with NSKeyed archiver is that it was an Objective-C API. So whatever could bridge to Objective-C could potentially make use of it. But that meant that enums and structs, which are a huge part of Swift, couldn't participate in any way without either being wrapped up in objects. And there were ways to do this. We could have kept the existing architecture, but it didn't feel right for Swift, and it didn't feel like what we wanted to do. We wanted to see if we could cut down on the boilerplate as much as possible. That was a big goal for us. Could we do something that prevents you from having to rewrite init with coder and encode with coder again and again for all of your model types, even the really dead simple ones that just hold data? Can we get away from that somehow?
Constantly update those every time you do change.
Or worse, yeah, forget to update them.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing. There's just not really a warning when anybody that works on that code is suddenly goes to change a property or add a new one, and now it's like, oh, we just didn't encode or decode that. So.
Absolutely, and it was NSKey.archiver has extremely powerful tools for doing data migration and changing things over time and renaming, but almost nobody was making use of those things. And sort of the most common way to write in an init with coder and encode with coder is sort of dead simple listing of all of the properties and then not validating, the input. Very few people, very little code in the wild did proper input validation, even though archives could come from almost anywhere. That's not something that we could solve with Codable, but that was a common symptom that we had seen of, okay, yeah, I have to fill out this boilerplate. Let me do it in the simplest way possible. It feels like rote automation, but what's the bare minimum that I can do to fulfill that requirement? So we wanted to get away from that if we could. Places where we could eliminate boilerplate, we wanted to get rid of. Places where we could use generics and other strong types in Swift, we wanted to use that as much as possible. Another thing that we saw a lot was between init with coder and encode with coder, you have to repeat a lot of key string values over and over again. We found in a lot of places that people would write out the string twice, and a lot of people would have typos in one of the two string keys, and so that would lead to, there was nothing the compiler could do to help you out. We wanted to not only make it easier to not make that mistake, but we wanted your key types to be something unique. We wanted to make sure, what could we do sort of to make use of Swift enums and other strong typing features to avoid all these common mistakes. So that was sort of the basis for why didn't we go with something that already existed? Because we had all this opportunity to do something new and sort of break out from old mistakes. So then we started looking at where could we go from here, and that's how a lot of the API came into being.
Cool. All right. So there's one thing I'm thinking about in particular, I guess, with that API, or at least the main struggle that you had, which was dealing with the compiler in particular with getting codables to work. Do you mind talking a little bit about sort of what those difficulties were and how you kind of contributed, I guess, to the compiler to make all this possible?
Yeah, so initially when we were working on the API, there were two big parts to this project. One is figuring out what should the API look like as part of a framework, whether it's Foundation, whether it's something else. It ended up living parts in the standard library, parts in the Foundation overlay, but we wanted to figure out, okay, what does the API look like? And then once we figured that out, we wanted to see, okay, what can we do to decrease the amount of boilerplate that you have to actually write? And I had tried many different approaches to tackle this from both ends. And at some point, we settled on a library side API that was really nice, but it didn't cut down on any of the boilerplate. It ended up looking similar to NSKey.archiver and NSKey.onArchiver with many other features, but you still had to write it out. And so we said, okay, what can we do to avoid having to write it out? And my manager suggested, okay, well, we control the compiler. We can submit something to compiler. And I said, I mean, great, but I'm not a compiler engineer. And he says, well, now you are. And that's something that I always appreciated about my manager, is that he was always sort of pushing me to think outside the box, in that sense of every time that I thought something was impossible, it just required a frame shift to realize that, okay, well, we can actually do this. Nothing was preventing me from contributing to the compiler. So the next task was figuring out, how could I actually contribute code to the compiler to help the compiler write out the code that you would be doing otherwise? And that really requires us jumping in and figuring out what are the capabilities of the Swift compiler right now? What can we make use of anything existing? And I was extremely lucky that there was. Swift has protocol conformance synthesis. That's not necessarily the exact technical phrasing for it, but there were some protocol types already in the standard library that if your type conformed to them, the compiler could synthesize a default conformance. So this included if you had an enum backed by a type like int or string, the compiler could automatically give you raw representable implementation for it using that type as your backing type, as your raw value. And so the difficulty was figuring out, okay, can we somehow make use of that existing infrastructure to build on top of that? And the answer was yes, we actually could. And it was a lot of learning, obviously learning all the compiler infrastructure. The compiler is written in C++, which is something that I've had a lot of experience with, but Clang and LLVM and the Swift compiler have their own sort of dialect of C++ and implementations they use. So there was a lot of learning out both the C++ library aspect of it, like how do I actually write the C++, but then learning about the compiler. How do I actually manipulate the abstract syntax tree of the Swift program that you're looking at? How do I insert things? There was a lot of trial and error there of figuring out how do I get generics to work? What sort of every program has effectively an API, as does the Swift compiler, and it was a lot of reading the code and trying to figure out where can I plug in? How do these things combine? There were a lot of compiler crashes as I was working on this because even though some types could fit together, it wasn't the right way to do things, or it ended up producing Swift IR that wasn't valid. And so it sort of took a lot of actual just learning. And that's not necessarily something you can speed up. It was just a lot of digging into it and trial and error and figuring out how do I tie it all together. The thing that was slightly less fun is that it takes an extremely long time to compile the Swift compiler. So that slowed things down a lot. But that was the basis for it, is just sometimes you gotta, bang your head against it until you learn it. And then once I did, it got a lot easier to figure out, okay, how do I put this together?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common thing with just learning in general too. Is it's one of those things where a lot of us have been accustomed to, we can always ask Stack Overflow for a lot of things and almost always get for most things we can get an answer that people have already asked a million times. But in those situations where you're working on internal Apple code or whatever, or even if it's the compiler, I mean, it's maybe not internal, but it's still, nobody's really putting Stack Overflow questions about it. So it's one of those, it's definitely one of those tricky things where you actually, got to use the brain that you got to learn some sort of knowledge that isn't really just given to you. And those are, I think, some of the greatest things about, I mean, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but neither of us work at Apple anymore. And we can talk about that in just a bit. But it was certainly one of the good things about working at Apple is that you are definitely pushed in certain cases to figure out things that is somewhat new ground. Like it's, there isn't necessarily already a known approach to doing it, and you're kind of breaking a little bit of new path there. So it's definitely one of the perks about working at Apple anyway. But
oh yeah, and yeah, I have to say I'm very grateful. At the time, I did end up getting a lot of help from the Swift compiler team. They were able to point out a lot of stuff that helped me out a lot, and the initial PR review took a lot of time to get through because they had a lot of stuff to point out to me, and I'm grateful for their input. But they also had their own full-time jobs at the time working on their own features. So
yeah, getting Swift out the door.
Yes. Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah. But I could go on forever pretty much talking about internal tools and how much of a nightmare that is internally and stuff. But yeah. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about that because that's a whole other thing that don't really care to get into, I guess. But I also was just thinking about the fact that back to, this is totally off topic, but we'll circle back around. But the original thing that I actually tried programming with was Flash. Now that I am thinking back on it, I don't know why or where we had this book, but my dad somehow acquired this book on programming and the Flash Macromedia thing at the time. And,
an action script, I think it was called.
Yeah, action script. Yep. And I remember just being completely lost in everything that I was doing there. Everything was like, this is the most obtuse, backwards thing I've ever. I still to this day, I feel like even though it was the first thing I was trying to learn, it did not come naturally at all. And well, maybe that's why it's gone now. I don't know. But that was what a nightmare that trying to program anything in that. But then I also realized that you couldn't really program an app out of it mostly. I mean, it was just for web games kind of, or little animations for the most part. So wasn't great for that. But anyway, so back to where we were. Obviously we've both left Apple and you are now not in California at all. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of, I guess, living in the Bay Area in general and reasons to potentially stay or leave, I guess? Maybe we'll start with the benefits of being there and working at Apple, and then maybe the reasons that you decided to not be there anymore.
Yeah, I mean, working at Apple was an amazing experience. It was completely formative. It was fulfilling a dream that I'd had, and ever since I was a teenager, I'd wanted to work on the foundation team specifically, and I sort of made it there. And working with such smart people was an amazing experience. I mean, it was the biggest collection of extremely intelligent people that I'd ever gotten to be around on a regular basis. And I'm really grateful for. I got to learn so much from all of my coworkers. Everyone had different approaches to things, but it was all new and exciting, and it was something to learn from. Even the boring stuff. Sort of, I internalized so much over my time there. That was fantastic, and Apple itself had wonderful offices in many respects. Uh, and
Very nice looking offices.
Yes. And great perks and stuff. I like the Bay Area. I love the weather. Traffic was less exciting, though it did give us a lot of time to sit in the car together and listen to the radio.
I think we did enjoy our morning radio listens quite a bit, and
Yeah,
I think I regretted because after a while I went off with my now wife and lived separately from you guys, but it was definitely a very quiet commute going to work and not as exciting, but
yeah.
got to rant about a lot of good things while we were stuck in traffic for 20 to 30 minutes.
Oh yeah. Mornings was usually singing bad pop songs, and then afternoons was usually me complaining about something. So, but there's a lot to miss. Yeah, my commutes were a lot quieter after that. Downsides to the Bay Area. I mean, there's definitely always things to complain about wherever you live. But we were talking about this a little bit earlier. But rent was an inescapable thing to complain about. Being far away from family. I mean, these are somewhat personal things, but.
Positive or negative, depending.
Yeah, everyone has a different situation. Some people, don't care about that. Some people care a lot more. Some people's family lives out there. So, for me, it was a combination of personal factors and wanting to sort of develop in a new direction. And so I found my current job at a different company, and that was extremely exciting. And it allowed us to move out of the Bay Area a little bit and to somewhere cheaper and closer to family. So.
Yeah, I mean, just for reference for people that don't actually know, I mean, we were paying how much for the 2-bedroom? That was $4,000 something for
$4,400 a month.
Yeah.
And the first time that we got the lease renewal option, they said, okay, you can either sign up for another 12-year period or start renting month to month at $5,500 a month. And so the answer was no, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah,
But,
we both my wife and we've found something that's cheaper, but it's also it's way smaller than the place we were in before. But it's when you compare where you are now and where I probably will live at some point in the future, that anywhere in the northeast area, well, really anywhere other than California that is the Bay Area. I mean, you can pretty much find something that's not that expensive. So, and
yeah.
Buying a house or you could even pay less on the mortgage than you would on easily pay less on the mortgage than you would on renting. So
yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, no, there's definitely reasons, and you're the first trailblazer to to leave the area out of my group of friends out here, but we'll probably be behind you not too soon. But nice thing is we can still video chat and all that good stuff, and it doesn't really change too much. So
yeah, true.
But especially when you're not needing to work at a physical location, then that's nice. Actually, before I let you go, the last thing I wanted to ask was sort of your transition between working at a physical location and then working remote, and kind of if you enjoy doing remote versus physical locations or not.
Oh yeah. So before I left Apple, I had decided that I wanted to try working remotely, even though I'd never worked remotely, and I was a little concerned The reason I wanted to work remotely was primarily because of wanting to move out of the Bay Area, and sort of what working remotely would give me is a lot of flexibility in where to live and how to structure. Instead of structuring my life around my work, I could structure my work around my life, and that's a balance that I'm a lot happier about. And so that was an opportunity that I wanted to look into. I did have an opportunity to work remotely for Apple. But I decided against it because I was looking for somewhere with a sort of great track record for a very healthy remote sort of experience and lifestyle. Not a lot of companies do remote great. I find personally that teams that are partially remote and partially not are really not a great place to be a remote employee. I think a lot of different people have different experiences, but I feel like I would not want to be the one person out on a team that doesn't get to sort of share a lot of experiences with other people, in the physical location. If you have teams that are too distributed, you really don't get to see other people, and that feels lonely. The place that I work at right now, called YNAB, YNAB, stands for You Need a Budget, YNAB.com. We are an entirely remote company. And that was really attractive to me because in an environment like this, beside the fact that the company, either knows how to do remote work right or probably isn't in business if you're entirely remote, everyone's sort of on the same footing. And I think that our remote culture is extremely healthy, and just really conducive to both getting work done, but also sort of getting out of the way. So for us, we almost never email. That's email, at Apple, I think I spent probably at least an hour a day going through email, if not more. At my current company, the number one source of emails I get is GitHub. Email is not a thing. We care a lot about, because of the distance, we care a lot about face-to-face contact whenever possible. We do a lot of video chatting. I got a webcam and a light and everything for this so that I could participate in calls and sort of, I love talking face-to-face with people. That's something that I was very afraid of sort of losing when going to a remote company. I was worried about not getting to see people's faces, feeling very lonely, and I don't feel that at all. I think that's something that a company that's really good at doing remote will find ways around. We use Slack to talk to one another live, but our sort of primary, if you go through a checklist of, okay, how should I contact this person? Usually video call or voice call is number one, if applicable. If it's something that you need to talk to somebody synchronously, talk face to face. We love that human connection. If it's not that urgent or the person's busy, we usually chat on Slack a little bit back and forth. I've never had to email someone, but that's sort of a last resort if you really need to get in touch with someone, but it's also not urgent. An email will do, but I've never used email for that purpose. And all of this sort of has given me the opportunity to, like I said, structure my work around my life and not the other way around. I love being remote, and I'm somebody who doesn't mind being at home a lot. I'm doing really well in the current COVID situation. I'm somebody who it
That does
doesn't
not surprise me at
up.
all.
Yeah, no, and I'm lucky that way. I know that a lot of people go stir crazy at home. I don't. So I work from home at an office here in the house. I know that a lot of people love going to co-working spaces. I do have coworkers that prefer going to a co-working space. I'm lucky enough that I managed to get space for myself in my own room, so that feels enough for me. And I'm lucky that there's no commute, there's no downtime, that doesn't need to be there. I'll say that definitely working at an office was really distracting in a lot of ways. Working in my own office by myself in my own environment lets me control a lot of variables. But more than that, I think, if I'm being honest, a lot of people in office environments and home environments, you can't be on all the time. I can't focus on work. I don't sit down and focus on work for 8 hours a day straight. I don't know anyone who really does that every single day, day in, day out. When I was at the office, I felt this pressure to always be productive, or at least always seem productive. And on those days where, okay, I really just can't focus on work, I'd spend the rest of the day looking, for things to do that I could, email. You can always go shovel through more email. But at the end of the day,
Easier radars, maybe.
yeah, and I would do that whenever possible. But sometimes, it's just the human condition. You slept poorly the night before. You really can't get any focusing done. There's not a lot to do but sit around at the office and try to look busy. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's ever been in that situation, or at least I hope not. But when you're
Just
at home,
talking for yourself right now.
yeah, no, I just gave myself away. I hope none of my old
Yeah, I'm
coworkers.
sure your employers are listening intently.
Yes, yes. But when you're working from home, that pressure goes away. If I realize, okay, I'm probably not getting any work done for an hour or two, I can go do something else and come back later and sort of not feel that pressure to always be on. I can structure the way that work needs to happen in a way that's more productive for me as a person. I don't necessarily sit down for 8 hours straight and just, type until it's done and then go home. So it gives me that flexibility that I'm really grateful for.
For sure. I mean, I definitely, while I was at Apple, that was certainly the case with people that were working remotely. It was this strange barrier between, like, you almost never contacted them, even though there were, one or two people that were pretty knowledgeable in certain things, and if they were nearby, you probably would have walked to their office and asked them a question about, this code that they wrote and you don't like it or whatever. But it certainly was the case that remote at Apple is not. You're right in that it's not really structured very well in that way. I am kind of curious to see how it would be working right now, because obviously everybody is at home there. So I'm sure they're all internally thinking a lot about what does that mean for working remote and how can we make this better. So I'm kind of looking forward to maybe what comes of that, because I can't imagine they work for, it's going to be probably a little bit more than a quarter of the year now for working at home, and I'm sure some of the people are starting to think about kind of the better ways that we can work remotely. So that's a little bit exciting anyway, if anything's positive at that. But and yeah, even working from, like, with the job that I'm currently at, everybody's obviously remote now too, and I think we've done a pretty decent job of kind of getting that face-to-face time for problems, and we've been using like just Slack to quick communicate, and a lot of coworkers have been pretty easy just to call when they want something instead of just having a text back and forth for 20 minutes that could have been answered very quickly. So that's pretty positive to see, and it'll definitely be something that I'm looking to have if and likely I would be working remotely if I move somewhere in the Northeast. So if that, it might be. If not, maybe Boston. I'm not really sure, but I think working remote would be the ideal kind of situation for me. But because I, like you, don't need that much human contact all the time. But I do like to, obviously it's fun to talk to people, and I always say that I'm begrudging around it, and then I always call people, and like just this past week, my friends and we played Catan online. I don't know if and it was just we FaceTime together and played that, and it was kind of fun, and before it you're kind of thinking like, do I really want to sit down and have but then you do it and you're like, okay, that was fun. But anyway, so it's it'll be interesting to see kind of how that works, and look forward to hearing more about how your life progresses going forward. I'm sure we'll be in touch more, but especially if I move out there, we'll hopefully meet up in person once again. But
oh yeah, when this is all over, we'll do it in person.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks so much, Itai, for coming on and talking about our life story together, I guess. It's always fun. So.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks.
And was there anything else you wanted to pitch before we close off?
Sure. If you're interested more about the company that I work at, again, it's called YNAB. YNAB stands for You Need a Budget. Our goal is to help people sort of learn how to best manage their money long term, the money that they have right now, get out of debt. You can see testimonials and everything on our site, but it's a company that I work at because I really believe in it, and I know that we're changing lives, and that's something that is really important to me. So if you're interested, check it out.
Great. All right. Well, talk to you later.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with your friends. Ways to contribute and additional information are in the description. I'll see you next week.